Hello, I'm Greg Krinklaw, the developer of SkyTools. I'm outside, it's getting dark, and I am ready to observe. Tonight, we're going to explore the real-time tool for visual observing and its various workflows. The real-time tool came about when I realized that the nightly planner did a poor job of telling you which objects to look at when you were already outside under a dark sky. So I decided to create a separate tool dedicated to use at the telescope at the current time, as read from your computer clock. In other words, it would always work in real time. This tool can directly control a go-to telescope or a scope connected via digital setting circles. But it's important to remember that you don't need to use either of these. You can think of the real-time tool as an assistant, there to help you decide what to look at right now. Ultimately, this tool is meant for use at the telescope, regardless of how you observe. Remember, other software can make lists of objects and generally tell you what to look at, but SkyTools takes that a big step further to ensure that you always get the best view, or the best chance to detect a challenging object. Sometimes people want to use the real-time tool for other purposes. I'm sometimes asked to be able to sort by columns, for example. Just as you wouldn't use a screwdriver to work on your pipes or a chainsaw to make furniture, it's best to use the appropriate tool for the job. These tutorials will show you the entire workflow and how the different tools are intended to be used together. In the process, the role of the real-time tool will become clear. There are two real-time modes, Best Now and SkyTour, and there are separate sets of workflows for each. The three main ways to use SkyTools in the field are to use on-screen finder charts to find your targets, a go-to telescope, or a DSC connected directly to SkyTools. I've created multiple videos depending on which of these methods you use yourself. If you don't use either of the telescope control methods or the finder charts, the real-time tool can still help you find timely things to observe at the telescope. In that case, I suggest watching the tutorials for using a go-to telescope and adopt a similar workflow for whatever method you use to find things in the sky. The planning process begins before we go out to observe. In my case, it was a few days ago. Our workflow begins with the nightly planner. One of the core principles of SkyTools is to plan your observing in advance. Now what that means is to find some great objects to observe before you go out to the telescope. The idea is to use the tools to find objects that are best observed on the night you plan to go out, and then put those objects in an observing list just for that night. These are the steps that we use the nightly planner and its associated tools for. When you go to use the telescope, the real-time tool tells you which objects in our final list to observe at any given moment. So we start by making a list of objects that are good on that night, and then the real-time tool tells us what time to look at each of them. I'm going to plan for an upcoming night using an 8-inch telescope as an example, and then I'll go out and observe on that night using the real-time tool. Now, if I was doing a special project such as the Herschel 400, I could skip this next step where I use the nightly planner to create a custom list and just load the Herschel 400 list into the real-time tool when our night comes. But when we want to observe a lot of different things, we use the nightly planner to create a custom list for that night. I've set the planner for March 24th, an observing location nearby, an 8-inch telescope, and me. The next thing to do is to set up the weather. Never forget the weather. I can't know exactly what it's going to be that night, but a good estimate would be a temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit and a humidity of 45%. I'll set the scene to be good. I'll be going to bed at 1 a.m., so I'll drag the right time slider to 1 a.m. I could also have typed it in here as the to time. I'll also tell it that I won't be set up until 7 p.m. This will tell the planning tools not to plan before or after these times. Remember, planets can be observed in daylight, and sometimes they are higher in the sky then, and better observed. The setup time will keep SkyTools from suggesting anything before we are ready. I'm going to create a new custom observing list via the List Functions menu. I'll call it March 24. The quick way to plan is to use the Nightly Observing List generator. So let's start with that. What this tool will do is to use the location, telescope, and night from the Nightly Planner. It also considers the time range that I just created. There is or will be a tutorial about using the Nightly Observing List generator that goes into more detail. I'm going to just touch on it here. A good place to start is showpieces. This one's great for a public event where you only want things that are bright and obvious. But it's also a good place to start in general if you want things to observe with little extra effort. For planning for a star party or any other night months in advance, it's best to use this tool close to the actual date you plan to observe so that the comet and supernova information will be fresh. The results are placed into a new list that is automatically created for this location and this night. I'm going to just take all of these. To do that, I'll right-click on the multiple selection column and choose Check All. Then I'll right-click in the column, it doesn't matter which object, and select the custom list I created earlier. This will copy all of the objects over. Now let's run it again, but for the NGC IC objects. I could append these objects to the list that the tool already created for this location and night in order to build on what we already had, but in this case, I'm going to just overwrite it. Once again, I'm going to just copy all of them. Here is the list for March 24th that I've created. It has 49 objects in it. I'll remove the ones that I've already logged. I'll right-click on the log icon and select Check All Log Entries. Then I'll right-click in the checkmark column and select Delete Checked Entries. This brings us down to 35 objects, which is a good number for 5 hours of observing. Now, that's the quick way to do this. But let's look at another way to choose objects for our list. I recommend keeping a special list of objects that you want to observe some clear night in the future. Maybe you see an HST image or read an article and think it might be cool to try to observe the object visually. So you'd add it to your special list. Here is an example list I created called Cool Objects. It's got its own attachments folder where I can keep track of why I wanted to observe them. I need to filter out the ones that aren't good on this night, as well as the ones that are too faint for this scope. So I'll set the filters to best quality only and visible at any difficulty. Looks like our only candidate is the Polar Ring Galaxy, NGC 4650. I'll right-click on it and add it to my custom list. I always want to add whatever telescopic comets are available. We added a couple already via the Nightly Observing List generator, but that tool is designed to give us a sample of really bright objects, not every single one available. So I want to add more. We'll go up to the current lists and open the current comets list. Comets tend to hug the horizon, and you can't necessarily look at them on a better night. So I'll relax the quality filter a bit. I love comets, so I'm just going to add them all. We can do the same for supernovae. Sometimes you may get no results using the best quality and visible at any difficulty filters, and that's okay. It just means that there aren't any visible in your scope that night. Another approach to finding objects is to use one of the pre-made observing lists. I'm going to load the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada's finest NGC list. I'll ensure my filters are set to best quality and visible at any difficulty. I'll also filter out the ones I've already logged. Let's see, the Ghost of Jupiter might be good, but is it large enough in the scope? I'll right-click to view it in the telescope finder chart. I could also press T with the object selected. It looks like it should be fine in my 8mm Radian, which has also been picked as the ideal eyepiece. So I'll check that one. What's this lost galaxy? That should look pretty good. I'll open the object info to learn about it. The catalog notes say it was discovered by William Herschel and that it's pretty faint, very large, and resolvable. Okay, I just did some Googling, and apparently Leland Copeland named it in the 1950s because its faint ghost-like appearance. I'll check it too. Now I could add more, but you get the idea. Use the tools on hand, such as the object info and the charts, to help you decide whether or not to observe an object. I'll add these to my custom list. Lastly, let's add some double stars. I'll load the most beautiful double stars list. For these, I'll add a splittability filter. Let's make it good split or better. I'm not that interested in challenging observations for these. Let's sort by the best time to observe so I can pick a few pairs to look at during twilight. I'll look for a fairly evenly matched pair. This pair looks good. I'll also open a chart. I can't see the separation because of the resolution of the monitor and the size of the stars drawn. So for the eyepiece, I'll select Match Detail. This will give me an idea of how well I can split the pair. It looks like it'll be a good one, so I'll copy Lambda Ori over. Again, I could add more, but you get the idea. Now that we've created the list that we're going to use, let's have a look at the real-time tool. It has two modes. They both work from an observing list. The Best Now mode is more freeform and relaxed, allowing you to observe at any pace and to choose which objects you want to view from its suggested objects that are at their best right now. The Sky Tour is more structured. You make a full plan ahead of time and then more or less stick to it during the night. You can customize the plan, spending more or less time on an object. The advantage of the Sky Tour is efficiency. If you were doing a large observing project, such as the Herschel 400, it can help you maximize the number of objects you can get during the night. It's also a great way to plan for Messier Marathon. The advantage of Best Now is that you can take as long as you want on each object and decide on the fly what to look at. We'll be using Best Now mode. Let's have a look at the list I've been building. Now, it's not time to observe just yet, so the real-time tool isn't ready to show us anything. But I can review the list in the nightly planner. I'm going to observe for about 5 hours or so. Let's assume 10 minutes per object. There are 300 minutes in 5 hours, so that works out to 30 objects. It's a good idea to have more than I can observe, so I think 39 objects seems reasonable. In practice, I may not get to all of them, but that's okay. Better that than to run out. Let's have a quick look at the refresh rates. From the telescope control menu, select Configure Real-Time Refresh Rates. This menu may say telescope control, but it also has a few options that are important even if they're not controlling a telescope with SkyTools. And this is one of them. The real-time tool follows the current time. To do this, it periodically refreshes the telescope status, the data in the observing list, and any charts that are open, to keep everything up to date. This dialog controls how often these things are updated. We'll start with the charts down at the bottom. The sky doesn't move that fast, so it is unnecessary to refresh the charts quickly. Every 2 or even 5 minutes is fine for most purposes. The simulation charts are the overhead sky, naked eye, and finder charts, customized for your telescope or binoculars. The observing list refresh is important. If you have a long list and a slower device, a list refresh may take several seconds or even longer. The list refresh can interrupt what you're doing with the list, so you don't want it to occur too often. On the other hand, when the sky is changing quickly, such as during twilight, you want it to keep up with the sky. A good refresh rate for a list with less than 100 objects is every 90 seconds. We'll be using the Sky Tour at the telescope, but it always uses the current date, meaning that real time can't give you a preview of the tour ahead of time. So here's a big tip. The plan function on the nightly planner uses the same algorithm as the Sky Tour. So to preview the Sky Tour, I'm going to set it for the date I'm going to observe, the telescope, location, and observer, and then enable it. But first, I need to put my estimates for how long it will take to find each object and how long I want to look at each one. I'm going to assume that it will take 1 minute to find each target, and that I want to spend 5 minutes looking at each. This is something we can tweak later, even after we start observing, but for now, this will give us a good idea of how well our list works. So now a plan has been generated for the list. This column tells us the time to start each observation. This column tells us the view time, or how long each observation is planned to take. The default value is the number from up here. The plan is naturally sorted by the time to start observing. If you want to sort by other columns, disable the plan. If we look at the status area at the bottom, we can see that 36 of 38 objects were scheduled. We hand-picked the objects for this night, so one might think that they all should have been scheduled. But sometimes too many objects need to be observed during a finite amount of time, and they won't all fit. In that case, one or more may be left out. Here's another tip. How can we find out which object wasn't scheduled? I'll right-click on the checkmark column heading and clear the checks by selecting Uncheck All. Then I'll select Check Displayed. What this will do is place a check mark next to every object that is being displayed. The objects that weren't scheduled won't get a check mark. Next, I'll turn off the plan. At the bottom, we can see that all objects are now being displayed. I just need to look for the ones without a check mark, and it's M79 and NGC 366. We can see that they are only at best quality for a limited period of time at the start of the night, which is likely a factor in why they are being left out. So, what if I want to see M79? Well, what I can do is raise its priority level. This is the priority column. If I right-click next to M79 in the priority column, I can elevate the priority to high. And if I re-enable the plan, sure enough, now it's included. If I use the check marks again to follow a similar procedure to before, I can determine which object was replaced, and it turns out to be NGC 3631. Rather than increase the priority of M79, I could have lowered the priority of NGC 3631. To do that, I'll reset the priority for M79 and set a lower priority for NGC 3631. And sure enough, we get the same result. M79 has replaced NGC 3631. I'm back. It's the early evening, and I've set up my scope. I'll be using the real-time tool in Sky Tour mode with the custom observing list that I created. This is a DAW, so I'll be finding each object using the finder charts on my laptop. I'll enable night vision, and by the way, there's a tutorial on using night vision mode. I'm using a red screen over my laptop, but I'll be using screen capture for this video, so you won't be seeing the added effects of the red screen. I've loaded the custom list I created and set the mode to Sky Tour. I'm a little rusty at finding things with finder charts, so I'm going to set the finding time to 4 minutes. I'll leave the view time at 5 minutes. I can change these as I go along if I wish to. The Sky Tour is designed to be heard. You need to have the voice enabled, and the volume needs to be high enough to hear at the telescope in order to get the full use out of it. Once you go to the eyepiece, it needs to be able to tell you when it's time to move on to the next object. The next thing to do is to update the weather. It's going to be 38 Fahrenheit this evening with a relative humidity of 33%. I'll keep the seeing it good for now until I get an idea of what it is after the sky settles down after sunset. I'll set the quality to best only and the visibility to visible at any difficulty. Oh, and double star splitability to good or better. I know I used these settings when I created the list, but these settings will also help create an optimized sky tour. Here's a tip. I'm going to be logging my objects as I go, and I don't want to have to enter the conditions for every one of them. I'll right-click on any random object and select Create Log Entries, plural. This brings up the New Log Defaults dialog, which is used to set defaults for when you want to enter more than one object at a time. For instance, you might want to enter old logs from a paper logbook. But it also works for entering logs on the same night. What you want to do in this case is to type in a default for the weather conditions. Typing in good seeing, good transparency, a few clouds near the horizon. And I need to be sure to save them. I'm going to be using the SkyTools Finder charts to find my objects, which causes a bit of a problem. The sky tour is based on when objects are visible in the eyepiece. During twilight, stars are visible in the eyepiece before they are visible in a magnifying finder, and long before they are visible to the naked eye. If there was a bright planet out in twilight, then I could be looking at it right now, but finding fainter stars without GoTo is going to be a problem. So I'll have to wait until the sky gets a bit darker. If we look at the tour, it has me finding the first star at 1926. It isn't even visible in the scope until 1930. That's because it gives me 4 minutes to find it. If I had an aligned GoTo scope, I could slew to it and wait for it to become visible, which is a great use of every minute of twilight. But in my case, I'm not going to have any way to find it that early in the evening. I'll right-click on Lambda Ori and open the Finder chart for my scope. It will automatically open at 1926, when I should start finding. And sure enough, it doesn't even show up. If I go ahead to 1930, then it appears, but only barely. And depending on the sky conditions, it may take even longer to appear in practice. And if we look at the naked eye view, there aren't any stars to use as guides, so this isn't going to happen. Let's try Beta Mon at 1935. And no, it's still not dark enough. It's not until we get to Hind's Crimson Star that enough stars show up to have a shot at finding it. Let's talk a bit about this finder chart. It may be different for your telescope depending on your finding devices, and it pays to spend some time customizing the chart before using it. This scope uses a Rigel quick finder, so I only need 2 views. If you have a magnifying finder, then you may require 3. My 18-inch Daub uses 3 views. To find things with it, I start with the naked eye view and use a red dot finder to put the scope in the right part of the naked eye sky. Then I switch to the finder view and adjust it to a more precise location. No hopping is required in this process. Finally, I have a look with my widest field finding eyepiece to spot the target object. If the target object is small or faint, I may need to identify the stars in the eyepiece in order to determine the exact place to look. This is the primary purpose of the eyepiece view. So let's say I was looking for a small or faint object that wasn't obvious in the eyepiece. For a scope on an equatorial mount, what I can do is push the scope a bit toward the west while I'm looking in the eyepiece, and note the direction that the telescope moves. Then I can return to the chart on the screen and grab the circle where the arrow meets the field of view, and holding the mouse button down, drag it to match the orientation in the eyepiece. If I do this right, the orientation of the stars on the chart should match the orientation in the telescope. And that makes it very easy to pick out the patterns, so that I can look in the right place for a difficult target. In a scope without a drive, like the one I'm using, I can just wait a bit and watch the direction that the stars drift instead, then align the arrow with that direction. On a small screen, it's usually best to look at one view at a time. To do that, depress the single view button. Then you can switch between views using these buttons at the top. At this point, I have 2 choices to start my observing. I can start the sky tour now and wait for it to progress to the Crimson Star, skipping the first two targets. Or I could wait until it's darker and start the sky tour then. But if I use a little trick, I can start this list over at that time, and I'll be able to see the first two objects after all. I'm going to go with the second option. Okay, it's now 1955, and I think it's dark enough to get started. Betelgeuse and Rigel are out, and I can also see Aldebaran. I think I can find Lambda Ori now. Here's the little trick. I'm going to reselect my telescope. By doing that, I'm signaling that it needs to start over from scratch, and it will recompute the tour starting at the current time. And I'll start the tour. Let's do a quick configuration. I'll click Settings. If you don't want it to automatically speak the object info, remove this checkbox. I can also turn off the tutorial, which gives us extra prompts and instructions. It's the same with the Finder chart if I don't want it to open. I'm using the Finder chart to find my object, so I'll be sure to leave it checked. I need to tell it that I have started finding Lambda Ori by pushing this button, which will open the Finder chart. This is the naked eye view of the sky right now. My target is on the line between Betelgeuse and Aldebaran, both of which I can see in the sky. And that's about what? About a quarter of the way between them? I'm going to go to the scope and use the Rigel Quick Finder to put the finder circle as close to that same spot as I can, based on only 2 stars. I know, right? Some people have trouble with that, but it's not really that hard, even when there's light pollution. I've already got my wide field finding eyepiece in. Okay, I'm at the eyepiece now, and I don't see the star, so I must have missed by a bit. Most of the time the target's obvious and in the field of view, but I know it's got to be close. And I see a glow just off to the left. I'll move it a bit, and there it is. It's obviously a double star, so I'm sure I got the right one. I can start a log by clicking the log button. It automatically opens it for the scope I'm using, my location, and the current time. All I need to do is type in my description of what I saw. Eventually, my allotted time is going to run out, and it will prompt me to move on to the next target, in this case, Beta Mon. If I finish early, I can move on by clicking Skip to Next Object. Unless you get really far ahead of the plan, it will move right on to the next one. If it tells me it's time to move on and I'm not done, then I can click Pause until I'm ready to move on. When I'm ready, I can click Continue. It will tell me to start finding, and I'll respond when ready by clicking the button. The finder chart will open, and I'll set about finding it. Once my 5 minutes to find it is up, it's going to read me the object information. You can control how much information is read via the settings. I'll click Configure. This allows me to set how much information it reads. Check everything if that's what you want to hear. This sets the maximum number of also known as designations to read. If there are notes attached to this object, I can have it read them to me, or just the notes brief, or skip them altogether. It can also list objects in the same field of view or nearby. The rest of these are self-explanatory. If it bothers you, you can turn it all off. I find that, especially if I'm observing alone, it's nice to hear this information while I'm looking at the object. We'll speed things along until I get to 19P Borelli. Okay, this one's going to be pretty easy. I just need to find these 2 stars in Perseus and place the circle about 1/4 of the way between them and a bit above the line. What I do in practice is to memorize the relative positions of the 2 stars and the bullseye, and then try to put the bullseye where I remember it. I often set it in the approximate position at the scope and look at the screen again to place it more accurately. By the way, I'm wearing an eye patch on my observing eye. Even with night vision mode and a red screen, I can't look at the screen and keep my dark adaptation perfect. So I keep a patch over my right eye and flip it up only when I'm looking in the eyepiece. If you want the best possible view, that is how to do it. All right, I placed the finding eyepiece back in the scope, and the comet is obvious. I'm able to trace the tail fully with my dark adapted eye. One final tip before I get back to observing. If you find the SkyTools voice to be too loud, you can lower the volume on your computer, but you can also lower the volume only for the sounds from SkyTools if you still want to hear other things at a higher volume. To do that, right-click on the volume icon and select Open Volume Mixer. Look for SkyTools. In this case, the chart is open, so it shows the SkyTools chart. Lower this volume and it will only affect sounds from SkyTools. Well, I'm going to get back to it now. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask on the SkyTools Visual Discussion Forum of the Skyhound Forums. I and others are standing by. Clear skies, and thanks for watching.